Hello and welcome to the Stafford Beer Brain of the Firm reading group with General Intellect Unit. We are here finishing up section 2 of chapter 20. This is taking our start from the middle of page 362. For the listeners, just a note that we have been in recess for 2 weeks over the holidays. So we're picking things up again here, but we've been away from the reading group for a while, so we may have forgotten some things from last time. But we will carry on. This anecdote about the Chilean codes is recorded not merely for the sake of completeness, nor to embroider a tragic event with trivial flourishes. If people could only see, when locked in conflict, that the distinctions drawn here apply to them and to their situation, détente would mean more than airport embraces. As to societary conflict in the post-industrial age, there are always at least three parties, management, workers, government, to a dispute, which makes the customary binary logic inappropriate, and there is a whole range of models and codes in continuous use, which is not within anyone's interest or perhaps competence to acknowledge. Can it be, then, that political naivete is a characteristic of politics itself rather than of commentators or those who intervene, much as economic naivete is characteristic of economics itself? We cannot, of course, advert to military naivete in the same terms, because this brand of childishness leaves all the protagonists dead. In developing figure 48 into figure 49, further problems of apparent naivete arise, and that is why these preliminary explanations have been given and commentary made on them. In order to penetrate further into the mechanisms that underlie figure 48, which derive from figures 6 and 7, we need to see the relevance of control theory in engineering, and to draw on figure 8 and its accompanying discussion. Here now is the specification for the bridge of understanding that has to be constructed in the mind. The realities of political crisis proliferate enormous variety, which defeats any attempt to depict the anastomotic reticulum that houses the invariants that underlie this complicated behavior. The bridge crosses from the apparently too chaotic, a tangled skein that beggars description, to the apparently laconic, a few lines and symbols without manifest richness, and back again. The cybernetician spends a professional lifetime walking this bridge. Without it, she or he may be trapped in a state that is either irrelevant because too spare at one end of the bridge, or otiose because engulfed at the other. Let us try the walk. Figure 49 redraws its predecessor and omits the attenuating connection that stands for a loss of variety in learning about the nature of the crisis initially, since this has already been discussed at length. The single transmission line that runs from input to output conveys the information that produces action, and we know that this is not a single line in reality, but a mass of tangled cabling. Each strand of it is under threat as to its physical existence, its probity, its susceptibility to be noisy, and its internal lack of redundancy. Each strand, then, in the Shannon sense, is a poor risk as a transmitter of valid data, and the tangled cable itself, despite its mostly accidental redundancy, will not offer much improvement, because it has not been because it has not been properly designed as a redundant net to protect its power to inform. Even so, we are not now primarily concerned with these defects, but with those that attenuate variety. is it in the nature of the channel that constitutes any strand in the cable to preserve variety in the Ashby sense that it can discriminate between all the states of the system that the crisis proliferates? The answer to this is no, and this is the reason why variety is shown as attenuating on the way from its input in A to the sensorium, where the conceptual model is now represented as the feed-forward function of the system. Justification for the negative answer could be offered at this stage of the description, but it will be much easier to understand when the description is complete. So looking at figure 49, we have the A, B, and C circles, which are in connection with each other, as well as this loop. Hang on, I'm just gonna mute. Someone's making sound. No. Oh, it's Matt. Okay. Got it. Yeah, muted now. Okay, good. Nice. Yes, so we have the loop that is connecting point A going around and then connecting into this core with its further connections at T2, T3, and T4. So we have the feedback loop, F of A, capital F of A, and then we have a sensorium, which has the lowercase f of A connected to a C of S. And yeah, so we can see the attenuation that's coming out of the input there. And I guess we'll get to the rest of it as we continue going. So any comments on this section here? Jeremy, go ahead.
Oh, Jake in the chat pointed out that CFS stands for Criterion of Stability.
Oh, thank you. Nice. So that is what is regulating F of A, or is in relationship with lowercase f of A, the sensorium. Boast, go ahead.
I just have like a quick question because I guess clarification. So when he's talking about these like multiple strands coming out, like that of course goes back to like the something pronounced the reticulum that's in figure 6 and 7. But would it be assumed that the path that's leading from input A would, like, even there's like a tangle of all of these different, things leading out from this system, would it be assumed that there's also the one coming from B and C, or is it just a mess in there? Like, I guess, like, do not all stable lines that exit the system keep going around to turn to action?
So that's a good question. As far as I can tell, so if we go back to the previous diagram,
I think A is just a label for the shape. It just happens to be next to the dot. It's not. At least that's right.
A is us in a situation where there are multiple actors.
Mm-hmm.
I got
okay.
you.
Yeah. Yeah, it says on page 354, figure 48, 3 major interest groups, A, B, and C, are depicted as intersecting the hatched circle in an imbroglio of developing crisis. We consider first the behavior of one of the 3 in cybernetic terms. So it's an arbitrary choice. But the others may have these loops as well. We're just looking at A as our primary consideration here. Okay. Shane, go ahead.
So maybe to pin it down to more concrete examples, let's say A is the party, B is capital, and C is, I don't know, the military or something. This is a huge multi-agent system. there's three big actors that are fighting it out over something. What's being depicted here is a very abstract representation of the way that the proletarian like hive consciousness will process the crisis and respond to it. So it's represented as the usual stuff we've seen of like, oh, there's a feed forward network and then there's a feedback network, almost like it was just a simple thermostat. But what's in the middle there, the sensorium and the lowercase f of a and the criterion of stability are the kind of representations of the kind of internal mental model of the crisis. But because we're not dealing with a single person here, we're dealing with, like, just say it's the party, right? Like it's the giant proletarian organ that we would love to build. All of that is just a horrific mess of implicit half models and stuff that's built up. It's the kind of group consciousness, or the group unconscious, most likely, right? And I think what Beer is kind of saying here is that, like, all of those like inputs are going to be every single person's and every member's sensory interaction with the crisis and their cognization of the crisis and their communication with each other and their conferring with each other about the crisis and the building up of a shared understanding in conversation and so on. That's what the model constitutes. It's the emergent conversational model. But all of that is crazy complex. It's tangled to hell and back, and it's always going to be an impoverished representation of the actual crisis itself. But of course, that's what's informing our action back onto the situation, and it's all happening in real time and distributed, because you're dealing with millions and millions of people all going about their things separately. So it reduces to a very simple diagram of a thermostat, but this is a fucking planet scale thermostat made of people. So horrifically complicated and tangled, even when it's just drawn as a simple single line. And then also capital will have its own equivalent of this process. They're like processes of conference with eeach other, and the kind of sensory stuff that they have going on and so on, and it'll all be very different for them too. So you can, and then, like, maybe just to cap it off, when you go to the right hand side of the diagram, you've got the output leading to action and back over to the left hand side. There's those intersects at T2, T3, and T4. So there's action that applies back to the party itself, back to A, and then there's action that applies to the action between A and B. So there's action you apply to yourself, that, like, the party discipline or whatever you want to call it. Then there's how the party moves against capital. And then there's the interaction between capital and the military, just to pick the three examples that I laid out. But all of those are part of your feedback. That's what you're acting back on. You're acting back on yourself, but you're also acting on the relation between yourself and other. And again, even that introduces another huge dimension of complexity.
Yeah, that's technically feed forward, not feedback, right? The
oh,
loop,
you're right. Yes, that's the action going back out, but the feedback is
the feedback is the dotted the dotted line is the feedback.
Right. So the feedback network tunes your action, which is pushing forward. Yeah, sure.
Bose, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I was just, like, under the assumption that, like, the thought process between A to the input is unilateral, in that it's just A thinking about A, right? It's not like regressing to A considering B and C. Like, I know that they all kind of collide back at the action, but I guess this is just A considering itself when it's finding that criteria of stability.
I guess so. Yeah. I mean, it's A's conception of its own involvement, and which is also a conception of the crisis, because A will never understand the crisis in itself. It'll only ever understand its own involvement. It's that kind of like phenomenal problem, or what have you.
So this you're saying, Shane, that this is a model of, you know, many thousands of people or whatever, but it could also just be an individual too.
Oh yeah, because the same dynamics are basically
it applies either way, right? Because you know, we still have like millions of neurons that are working through our situation.
Right?
Yeah. You
get the repetition of the model at different scales, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, I believe the sort of level that Beer is talking about here is supposed to be that sort of higher level. He talks about kind of more or less like, let's take Chile as an example, and Chile in its international context. Earlier in the chapter, he kind of suggests that, while also saying this is a more general thing than just that. Okay, so let's keep moving. There'll be more explanation of what's going on here. The feed forward function, lowercase f of a, is necessarily a function so complicated that it can never be accurately specified in terms of the unknown equations connecting the myriad unknown variables that the anastomotic reticulum includes and manipulates. This does not mean to say that it cannot be accurately specified at all. Certainly it can, for the sensorium is a black box which operates on an input to produce an output, and, consult the definitions of Chapter 2, the feed-forward function is simply the ratio of these two. But it might well be asked in this very high variety crisis and amid all the chaos, how can this ratio possibly be labeled simple? How can it even be conceived of as a consistent function at all, when this black box could be merely a random number generator, a box that absorbs inputs, ignores them, and capriciously issues arbitrary outputs? The answer to this question is, well said. The debate enshrines a truth worthy of its few paragraphs. So yes, the lowercase f of a, the feed forward function, is an anastomotic reticulum there. It's the lowercase f of a is on the main line, the uninterrupted line there, right, which is the feed forward, and then the dashed line is the feedback. So yeah, that's what's going on there. All right, so let's continue. The sensorium houses a conceptual model, the pattern of operations of which, as a decision taker, constitutes the feed-forward function. We saw in 1 that this model does not have requisite variety. This is precisely why it is able to behave with consistency. In the diagram, there appears a solid black dot at the point where input is transduced into the sensorium. Solid black dot where input is transduced into the sensorium. I see, okay, that is T1, right? No, it's the left side of F of A of the sensorium.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. The transduction involves a homomorphic many-to-one mapping of the variety. That is to say, input variety, already attenuated, though it will be, will again be attenuated insofar as the conceptual regulatory model cannot contain it. This is an interesting point that Beer makes, right, is that our model of the world does not have requisite variety, and this is exactly why it's able to be consistent at all, right? The fact that it doesn't have requisite variety means that it has some degree of consistency, because the amount of variety out there is so much. If the model was just, if the map was the territory, it wouldn't be very useful at all. Okay. So, suppose, for example, that we were expected to take action of some kind in response to a scene full of elaborately changing color patterns, when a certain feature became a particular shade of yellow. If we were forced to survey this scene through a screen of glass filters that reduce the scene to primary colors, then the transmission line would not have requisite variety to distinguish the particular shade of yellow concerned. We should make many errors, but at least all our outputs would be yellow rather than, say, red. Next, suppose that a witch appeared and transformed us into dogs. These dogs have no retinal cone cells, and their conceptual model of the scene is without color altogether. It is composed in chiaroscuro. Then, the mapping of our particular shade of yellow would coincide in our model with shades of other colors as well, at some equivalent level of grayness. This illustration is meant to show that independently of variety attenuation in the transmission, variety is lost in transduction into the sensorium, because the transducer may recognize only that variety which the conceptual model itself can discriminate. It follows, therefore, for party A that the variety of its own model decides the variety of the crisis. Then the reason why its feed-forward function is a relatively simple and consistent input-output ratio is because input variety has been attenuated in initial perception, and in transmission, and finally in recognition within the conceptual model. No wonder that better dead than red. No wonder that this or that ethnic group is wicked, while that and this ethnic group, namely us, is impeccable. And in the limit, if even these dichotomizing tricks should fail, so that the cumulative pattern of the three variety attenuators just mentioned should result in no pattern at all, however crude, then the sensorium is reduced to a variety of one. Something rather than nothing has occurred. There is a crisis, but it has no pattern. It is incomprehensible. No wonder, then, that there should sometimes be a random response as earlier predicted. Yet even this is subject to bias when we are dealing with viable systems. For the random response has a value in a metasystemic calculus, that of survival itself. Thus, we may expect the response that was foreseen to be random to verge towards the catatonic. There is more survival value in lying low when you have no idea as to what may be going on than in leaping on a horse and riding off in all directions. Okay, Shane, go ahead. And then we'll go to Jake.
There's so much here. I kind of love it. So the thing with like the random responses is that like when you're dealing with probabilistic things and you're trying to select a strategy for responding to a situation, you might think, oh, you have to select a strategy that performs really well, but actually, you need to select a strategy that performs better than random chance. That's the baseline is randomness, not null action. So in these kind of like game theoretic terms, you don't assume that your default action is to take no action. You assume that your default is to take random action. And Beer identifies that as the baseline here as well, that like this kind of like random thrashing would be the baseline we judge all other kind of possible strategies against. And like there's examples in the world. Like I mean, a lot of like hedge fund managers and like high frequency trading sort of people, they actually perform worse than coin tosses at their job, which means that they're actually worse than useless. It would be more useful to do nothing, which is that kind of like catatonic state. And that catatonia is a thing that like organisms do, right? They go into like depressive states to just give up on action momentarily while the crisis is so chaotic and threatening, rather than continuing to bother processing the thing. I mean, I was reading a thing recently that was about that, right? That was like that in human beings and in all kinds of organisms, depression is actually like a biologically functional thing to do. That like when you're faced with a crisis, you get anxiety, right? You go into fight or flight mode, and you get this like hyper observant, hyper aware, very skittish disposition. But after a while, with persistent threat and persistent danger and persistent chaos, the organism just goes, your nervous system will actually start to shut down, like when a rabbit goes limp in a fox's mouth, because it's trying to spare you the pain of continuing in that chaotic environment. And I think that's all perfectly functional at the biological level. And I think that's kind of, there's an analogy then to like the kind of revolutionary depressivism, that like when revolutions can't sustain themselves, through these like extremely chaotic scenarios, and people and institutions kind of lose hope, right? They go into this catatonic state. They decide it's better to pack up and go home and hope that the fascists don't come knocking on their door rather than persist fighting and so on. So yeah, there's a lovely amount of stuff going on here that is. All of this seems really important. I think there's probably a lot more to tease out in these couple of paragraphs, but I'm not gonna try.
Jake, go ahead, then we'll go to Matt.
Yeah, I think this is definitely, there's definitely a lot, especially like even in the next like page and stuff. I kept like trying to reread it and then like reading a paragraph and then realizing I didn't really understand what was going on and having to start it over again. But I think what he's saying is important about how, right, like things in crisis situations especially are so chaotic, it's impossible to be able to respond to them as an organism or as an organization, or not respond to them, but just respond to everything, every potential, and so basically, I think what I've understood from this is that it's like cutting off all potentiality of like, oh, what's actually happening here? It's so complicated that we're just going to say nothing's happening and we'll just do what we always did or what we're going to do anyway. And I keep thinking as he says all these examples of just like how the state responds to like the crisis of like Black Lives Matter uprisings over the summer of just sort of defaulting back to just shoot them, just use the police. And then when 2 days ago, right, and there's these like right wingers in the Capitol, it's like there's such a disorganized response because they were so not used to like kind of this sort of far right. I wouldn't say far right protesting, but like anyone being in the Capitol without authorization, right? Like that idea was so like foreign. I think there wasn't a contingency plan. I mean, or it doesn't even matter, right? If there was a contingency plan, the point of a system, the function of a system is what it does. So the fact that they didn't do anything means if there was a contingency plan or something, then it wasn't implemented, and so it didn't really matter that it existed or didn't exist. And so yeah, I think it's definitely interesting to sort of like tease out what might overload a system that you are in opposition to and like see where there might be some kind of opportunity for like useful things coming out of it. But I think that also means like the party or whatever needs to, again, like we've talked about before, I think like needs to have the requisite variety to like allow for those potential responses that are like very much out there and aren't just like we just like sort of march in a circle or we just like sell newspapers or something. It's like we can't just like fall back on those things. I think I know we've said this before. Can't just fall back on those old methods. Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess with this reference to the Capitol getting stormed by a right-wing mob a couple days back, and what happened there in this sort of very bizarre farce of a color revolution, maybe you could make reference to like the de-escalation tactics that the Capitol Police used, right? Like just buddy up with everybody, let's just let them in, like that might be the baseline that they went back to, as opposed to like a sort of completely frantic response. They had this kind of like, well, we'll just basically give in and let them in and de-escalate until it's over. So that's maybe the sort of better than random chance baseline that they were operating off of. Who could say? There's a lot of backroom maneuvering that was going on around that, but as to what the police on the ground did, that's kind of seems like maybe it was the training that they fell back on. If it just wasn't just their inclination to have fun with their buds. Matt, go ahead.
Nah, there's so much in these couple of chapters, paragraphs even, chapters too. But yeah, like when it's talking about the no wonder this or that ethnic group is wicked or better dead than red or whatever. Like I think the flip side of that is that that actually often is like kind of adaptive. A friend enemy distinction that actually something simple is often a lot easier to transmit than something complicated. Like I'm picturing like the vaccine rollout here, where like vaccines are just rotting on the shelf because of all these complex rules. Versus like if you just had a very simple rule that you can propagate, vaccinate anyone that comes in. That would actually like help the coordination among like these very distributed agents that don't have like quick communication with each other, don't have great like lines of communication that do exist have like very high latency. And so like I feel like for a lot of like leftist organizing, things that hurt bosses and help workers are good. Just anything that fits that, and especially anything that transfers control from bosses to workers. Anything that helps tenants and hurts landlords, you're good. And that really helps that kind of large scale coordination. And also want to echo the stuff of where inaction is actually is adaptive. I'm thinking of there's a chess thing, Zugzwang, that basically says that it takes advantage of the fact that you don't have an option to not move on your turn in chess. And so there's a lot of strategy that relies on the fact that they have to do something. So there are a lot of situations where in theory like if you could do nothing, you actually would be better off. But like if you can put people in double binds where they have to move, then that's useful. And I think it's also like kind of a culmination of like how fixated Beer is on them like different levels of abstraction and recursion, because like that's part of what you get when you can actually go between different levels of recursion. Like like the fact that a crocodile actually can just like go into torpor and not eat for a year, like that is incredibly useful. Like there's nothing really like on this time frame for me, so until things I'll just wait and hope things get better. And I think a lot of organizations like they don't have that capacity, right? They're totally dependent on momentum. Like they really don't have the ability to go into torpor and then come out again. They're more like most mammals, where if you just like lie there for 2 weeks, like you'll just be dead. If you had an organization that actually had the capacity to go into torpor and just like reactivate like when they need to, like that'd be quite the thing.
Sorry, I didn't quite follow your example of Zugzwang. Zugzwang is a case where you are at a disadvantage because you have to move because that's the rules of chess. But what were you trying to suggest with that?
So like versus so like a crocodile that can go into torpor or a bear that can hibernate, is like the equivalent of if in chess you could
could skip your turn. I see. Yes. Got it. Right. Yeah. And often case in chess, players will try to find ways to make quiet moves that are as close as possible to being able to not do anything. That makes a lot of sense. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm with Matt on a lot of that stuff, right? And I think a lot of that relates to the. I think it kind of helps clarify my thinking on some of my kind of like problems with like the activist mindset, which is like a kind of shark, where if it stops moving, it'll just dissipate. It'll like, yeah, rather maybe there is actually great virtue in being able to go into deactivation mode rather than forcing yourself to always expend energy and wear yourself down, which is, I think, quite contrary to the usual sort of activist mindset and like the usual left mindset, where it's, oh, we got to push now, comrades. We're moments away from the barricades. It's just one more push, and it's always one more go around the wheel, burning more people out. Whereas there might in fact be virtue in just allowing yourself to go into hibernation for a little while and come back when you have strength. Like maybe it's a kind of strategy of patience, I guess. And also, like, I think the kind of variety reduction that Beer is going on about here is the kind of the negative sense where you would like to understand more of the world. But there is also, I think, as Matt was alluding to, the kind of positive variety reduction of heuristics, of quick and dirty rules that allow you to make decisions rapidly without needing to know all the details of things. And those still definitely apply, even if it's possible. It's possible to end up in pathological situations of variety reduction, but there are also like quick and dirty heuristics that can really help you to act, such as, generally favor an action that will increase the power of the workers or whatever.
Well, and I think when we cover understanding class on From Alpha to Omega, this is really going to be a question that comes up, because that book is in many ways trying to complicate the Marxian class framework. So, we will see the advantages versus disadvantages of doing so. Jeremy, go ahead.
So one thing to point out is the way people are educated and the way their minds evolve and the way they develop epistemologies in this particular historical moment causes them to reach a place where if the variety gets too high, they have to shut it down, no matter what's going on, no matter whether that's a good strategy or not. And so you get this sense of, I can't respect people's pronouns. That would be too complicated. How am I going to remember what people's pronouns are? And it's because they're like, too much variety. We need to shut down variety. There's only two genders. Fuck, and so, there's a lot of that, and our culture really exacerbates that. The idea that there should be lots of variety is really, really pushed against. It doesn't really need to be that way. I mean, we could have a society where everyone's just high on acid and just recognizes all kinds of crazy shit and be like, cool, that's fine. I mean, there are a lot of shamanic cultures where you're like, you're in an astral state. Fine. Okay, cool. Hi, I'm here on Earth, But there are reasons we don't do that. As societies get more complex, it's easier to control them if you minimize local variety and have the control of variety always be at the top, not at the bottom. If the bottom has too much variety, it's too hard to control. So, it's interesting to see, Caligula elected his horse onto the Senate and did all kinds of things that were just batshit, but it was fine because he was at the top, and the variety on the bottom wasn't really affected by any of this. If you wanted to take the legions and have them fight a war against the sea, that was fine. Have them march into the water and stab the water with their gladii, fine. Wasn't really threatening to the system. It's the same way. I mean, people ask, why was Donald Trump the president for 4 years and not turn America into a smoking crater? And it's because, it's fine for the top to have that shittery as long as there's effective control going all the way down the hierarchy.
Yeah, I mean, I think fine is a bit of a stretch, but it's maybe it's tolerable it's tolerable to have Caligula in charge or to have Donald Trump in charge. It's not like it's totally copacetic and fine.
It is fine with tolerating it itself, but it is still horrific. But like, maybe that's the big contrast, is that, like, you know, we take a huge objection to all this kind of shit, but the system doesn't. It fucking loves it. It's fine with bullshit. We don't like bullshit, but it loves it.
Yeah. I mean, you know, like, this stuff erodes the system. It's bad for the system, but it's not instantly lethal or.
I'm fucking drinking here, you know. Of course, things are bad for the system, but still, the system will still do it. Certainly.
Yeah. It's not going to put the system into an instant emergency response, a full emergency response.
I mean, I think the reason, like, Lenin's adage, every cook can govern, is really threatening to a system where you don't want the cooks governing, you know?
Oh, sure.
And, you know, coming up with the idea of high variety proletariat is kind of terrifying, you know? I mean, Orwell's description of Barcelona in 1936, where the proles exhibit very, very high variety and therefore don't need leaders, that's an amazing passage in Homage to Catalonia, where he says, it was the first time in my life I'd been in a place where the proletariat was in the driving seat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very, very good part of that book. Definitely. Okay, let's keep moving on. All right, so the next step in the process is strange indeed. It is, as the diagram shows, a variety amplifier, and an amplifier of very high gain. Consider, there is a basic requirement, as argued in Section 1, which spoke of a need in very principle to balance the variety equation across the sensory motor and anastomotic reticulum because of the pertinence of Ashby's law within the crisis, given that the regulatory loop is closed. Everything so far discussed about the loop that provides the channels to this end, from a continuous registration of crisis within the hatched area through the input at A to the model represented by the feed-forward function lowercase f of A, diminished as it in turn is by subjection to an established criterion of stability, has led in product to a huge attenuation of variety in the conceptual model. The self-organizing viable system, because it is also self-conscious, recognizes this attenuation. Probably it has no real insight into how that attenuation arose, and that is why we often speak in such circumstances not of a reaction, but of overreaction. The high gain variety amplifier overreacts because it is frightened by Ashby, in the same sense that someone leaning over the rail of the observation platform on top of a skyscraper may be frightened by Newton, and leap backwards instead of merely withdrawing. So there's this kind of like understanding within the system that you need to attenuate such that your variety equation across the sensory motor anastomotic reticulum is balanced, right? Your reaction is proportional to the sensory input that you are getting. And we have a sense that we might be overreacting because we're trying so hard to balance these things. And that is the being frightened by Ashby point, as opposed to the much more obvious one, frightened by Newton, which is, well, you're just scared of gravity and the distance between you and the ground. Shane, go ahead.
So I think I take it also to mean that, like, like you get the scare from Newton, and then you leap backwards instead of just merely withdrawing away from the rail. But there's an implied possibility that you would jump backwards off of the platform by accident. And I think maybe in a kind of revolutionary situation, it's more something like, oh, there's something happening on the ground. We kind of don't really know if these people are they counter-revolutionary insurgents, or are they just mooks just milling around? We better send the armed guards down there just in case. And I think that the system or the organism is kind of conscious of the fact that it doesn't know. It is conscious of the fact that it has lost information somewhere along the line. And so there is a sometimes conscious and sometimes unconscious impulse to overcompensate for the loss by acting harder than you really need to, out of an abundance of safety, but also that can get you into disastrous scenarios, either when you leap backwards off of the platform that you were trying not to fall off of, or when you send armed guards to go investigate people who weren't a fucking threat anyway, and end off kicking off a nuclear war by doing that. So I'm not totally sure that it's stated explicitly in the text there, but I think that's my sort of reading of the implications.
Well, I think oftentimes in these situations, where you're leaning over the rail on an observation platform on a skyscraper, you leap backwards and then you're embarrassed because your reaction was not really very sensible. So this is just, it's embarrassing. Even if it's not lethal, it's still an overreaction.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah. Okay, so the argument is that the simplifications embedded in the regulatory model deprive it of requisite variety, in recognition of which that variety is ostensibly but not actually restored, essentially by shouting. This is not to confuse sound amplification with variety amplification. By declaring a monumental platitude or a crude oversimplification with conviction and an air of authority, the politician seeks to convey the impression that since obviously nothing could be that naive, it isn't. There are hidden depths in the underlying conceptual model, comes the implication, which you would not understand, or which it is not in the national interest to divulge. At any rate, says the tacit message, our model can match the variety proliferated by the crisis. It cannot, and the fact that the claim is spurious is often signaled by the hectoring attitude of the speaker, bolstered as it sometimes is by phrases such as, "For heaven's sake, everyone knows," and that favorite North American version, "Aw, come on now." They tell us that the regulatory model in lowercase f of a does not enjoy requisite variety. Yes, the best people. Now, if the action taken in the crisis were to be based on the output of this forward transmission line as described, serious mistakes would certainly be made. Then we shall invoke the capabilities of an error-controlled negative feedback servo mechanism, as described in Figure 8, its accompanying text, and the mathematical note at the end of the same chapter 2. Output is compared with input, as indicated in Figure 49 by the circle with cross inscribed, to generate a signal measuring error that is added into the forward transmission, according to a set of rules embodied in a feedback function, uppercase f of a. We saw in Chapter 2 the circumstances in which the feedback loop comes to dominate the whole circuit, and the claim was advanced that thanks to its operation, the output signals will be of greater purity than we had any right to expect when the input is noisy, as in this case it was demonstrated to be. In the context of crisis analysis, however, this protective device seems not to work properly, maybe because it does not exist. If it does exist, then its operation seems to be counterproductive, in that crises so often tend towards increasing instability and eventual explosion, rather than to damping and eventual equilibrium. It will perhaps be remembered that the conceptual model informing the forward function lowercase f of a is chosen not because it offers the best available representation of the world, but because it is competent to effect the change within the mores that are acceptable to those in charge. The discovery of a great truth might not be amenable to registration in this conceptual model, simply because discoveries are new. Then the great truth would have no capacity to engage in changing anything. By the same token, the only uppercase f of a feedback function that can be heard by the action-taking process on the forward line must be using a model of lower variety than that in use by the conceptual model in f of a. Unfortunately, from a cybernetic standpoint that seeks stability, if fortunately for the freedom of speech, such a feedback function does exist and is indeed counterproductive towards stability. It is quite clearly provided by the mass media. They amplify variety in the spurious sense defined above, thereby making the total dynamic system depicted in Figure 49 as dangerously explosive as we know it to be, and as unequipped with requisite variety to handle crisis as we feared. For the variety generated by the crisis is likely to proliferate with time, whereas the matching variety of the regulative mechanism here described must resolutely fail. All right, Jeremy and then Shane.
This is what Twitter does. Twitter has very, very high variety. It's very, very rapid. And so it's very easy when a crisis happens to tweet. It's not very good necessarily. I mean, some Twitter feeds are great in a crisis, but most are not. But we've reached a point where when Beer is writing, he's talking about Walter Cronkite or the BBC. And today we're talking about somebody tweeting almost right away, even at the scene while things are happening. We have 24-hour news channels, Deutsche Welle, the BBC, CNN, things like that. But they're usually not happening at the speed of Twitter.
Yeah, so Twitter as a lowercase f of a is something I don't quite understand because, the feedback function should be trying to achieve some kind of equilibrium, right? It should be modifying the feed forward function, but Twitter doesn't really do that. It's kind of just amplifying and so I'm a little bit confused by this section because he's like, oh, it doesn't exist, or maybe it does exist, but it's really maladaptive, and that much I understand. I just don't understand exactly why it's positioned as the feedback loop here. Shane, go ahead.
One thing that jumped out at me was the whole thing about even the new discoveries, or the model can only accommodate whatever's inside the parameters of the model, right? The mores of the acceptable. But it reminds me of Kuhn and Lakatos, right? Like this thing of scientific research programs and how you don't really get smooth updating of scientific models. You get you just wait for a bunch of people to die, and then you can finally play the forbidden music and research the forbidden theories, right? You can bring new truths to a social kind of cognitive model, or a media sort of model, or our kind of mutual social models. But if it just doesn't fit the pattern, it'll get chucked. And you're kind of stuck within, I guess that also goes for any kind of Marxist research program or whatever, where these inconvenient truths just get dropped, or really challenging kind of elaborations on the theory or even the economic theory just get fucking ignored because it's not the immortal science, and so on. The Twitter thing, I guess maybe in Beer's era, what he's getting here with the mass media is that the mass media have a narrative that they stick to. It's very that West Wing sort of media. there's an accepted narrative, and there's no facts allowed that'll challenge the narrative. Whereas I feel that Twitter, by comparison, is more like a kind of Boltzmann brain sort of just random process that like may or may not cohere into anything, but is just kind of almost entirely noise. I do take Jeremy's point though about like the lag, right? Because I mean, a couple of weeks ago, or like before Christmas, like we live close to a harbor, and there was a huge fucking fire down at the port. So my family and I just scooted out of the house and went like a half a mile down the road. And we were like checking for news, and like the official news channels were all like a half an hour behind like what we were seeing on Twitter. People just live broadcasting. It's like, oh, these developing sort of things. It was kind of remarkable how ineffective the official media really was at updating anyone on the evolving situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was the reason why Twitter blew up in the first place. It wasn't because it was an echo chamber of social climbers screaming at each other. It was because it provided like instantaneous news, and then it became the other thing, and it kind of reverts back when a crisis happens. I guess, there's a kind of like sense making that happens on Twitter, which I guess you could describe as a feedback mechanism for sure. But it has that kind of exaggerating tendency to it as well. Okay. Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's definitely like interesting. I don't know if Twitter would be that different from what he's describing, other than that like T1 might not be like that night, and it might be that next second. But I think that just means that the potential for variety amplification is way higher, because you're getting feedback much quicker, and so the loop can operate much quicker. I think that also like sort of speaks to the need for like a competent like organization, like a competent revolutionary organization, to have like some mechanism of like feedback gathering and basically a competent system too, right? But one that isn't like Twitter, because of the massive variety that's just generated there, that like basically like eludes all potential like attenuations of it. But yeah, I think, and yeah, definitely this like also just gets back to what we've said before of like, if something new comes along that isn't within the framework of the system, like it's not conceivable to them that this is a thing, then it's just cut it off. It's like a couple months ago, my girlfriend was fired from her job because she was complaining to the CEO one too many times that her coworkers weren't wearing masks. And his response was, "What are you talking about? There's a policy in place. Everyone wears masks." She sends him a picture that shows them not wearing masks. She gets fired. It's like cut off the variety there. It's too much variety. You're saying that people aren't obeying the commands that I have. Ooh, get out of here. You're not a fit for this company. So it's like that kind of thing. Yeah, it's frustrating, but yeah. So it's a similar thing. I think, Jeremy, you brought up the degradation of the Bolsheviks as the Civil War goes on, and then I would say also like as Stalin purges the original Bolsheviks against reduce that variety, reduce the people who might have a perspective that's based on things that happened before the end of the Civil War, because that introduces too much variety into your system than you're able to handle. Yeah, I think personally, like understanding the kind of the way that a system or organization will cut off, just close its ears and just go la 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 when when you bring in some information that's not equipped to deal with, really has shifted my perspective on that kind of thing. I think it's a really great way of understanding why outside of the kind of liberal or individualistic conception of well, this person just doesn't want to listen to me. But it's no, the system is not set up to handle the input that you're giving it. For whatever reason, you can kind of interrogate that, but and I think it's interrogating that is a much more useful and fruitful venture than trying to like, say, oh, well, why does this person not like me or something? It's like, that won't get you anywhere really. So yeah, and then I think, I think the feedback loop that he sort of describes and puts in figure 49 that he elucidates in this part of the chapter is really important. And it's like, yeah, it's just key to have that, like the correct attenuators and amplifiers to get the relevant information and filter out the noise, right? That's ultimately what you want to do. And, I just wanted to say something also about like the Jeremy wrote, like the ban on factions. It's like, in one sense, yes, right. That is being frightened of the potential variety of it. But then on the other hand, there is the like argument of, you want people cohering, like you want the organization to be a coherent whole, and you don't want people spinning off their own kind of like viable system within your system that's not like handled by system one, right? Maybe a good system would have the proper system 2 and 3 and all that stuff to handle those existing, but I think within the people who can constitute those like a faction within like a party, they could start to, without the proper like constraints, right, spin off in a direction that's like counterintuitive to the direction of the whole organization, and it can lead to splits, I think. But again, it's like the answer is not to ban that, right? The answer is not to cut off that variety. It's to have the proper channels to like attenuate it in the proper way, So I think yeah, people are frightened of the unknown, I think, and that is part of the goal of revolutionaries is to like inoculate people against that like fear and assuage their fear by like doing good things, I guess. I don't know how to assuage people's fear on that, but
yeah. One thing I was thinking of with the feedback point is like, we saw in the earlier chapters that the feedback tends to predominate. And so if you have, Twitter operating on this like second by second feedback loop, you kind of have the potential of getting into this like Baudrillardian situation where the feedback loop is absolutely predominant over the situation on the ground that's being reported, and the simulacrum comes to dominate. Now, I don't think I've actually seen that happen anywhere. This, whenever I've followed these kind of like developing breaking news sort of situations on Twitter, it always feels like Twitter is lagging behind the situation that's happening there. People are trying to make sense. And then within like a couple hours after it happening, you have some kind of narrative that's developed. And it's like, okay, now everything is framed in terms of that narrative. Everyone's fighting over the narrative. But at the moment, it's not like the narrative is absolutely predominant over, say, someone lighting a fire in the back of a building or something like that. It's just I don't think that like absolute predominance is something I've ever actually seen happen instantaneously, even though it does tend to happen after a short time. Boast, go ahead.
There we go. So I guess it's just like a general question, but how far do you think that we can like drag this model around? Like, I know that we keep talking about it in terms of like, there's 3 distinct states or municipalities or whatever that are interacting with each other. But in terms of crisis, like since crisis can be everything from like the ecological level, like in really small terms, like let's say 3 interconnected species on an island are experiencing an ecological crisis, how much of this can we apply to that situation? Similarly, going back to the roommate example, if the crisis in this case is not something that is immediate, but it is immediate in this case, like a bust water vein, like you can't kind of hide the fact, no matter like how poorly you're attenuating the variety, whether or not your apartment's flooded. So then kind of like building up to like the global stage, I'm looking at this situation with respect to global warming and how it's almost like the nature of that crisis permits us to be so elusive about responding to it. And how like that crisis almost defines how we create that capital F of A that makes us no longer have the variety to understand what's going on. And I guess my question is, like, would it be improper to try to like drag this model around, or is this specifically a model that is just about like states interacting with each other and a mass media interacting with those states?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably more general than that. I mean, as far as the dichotomous conceptual apparatus that's been used with regards to the global warming crisis, it's been, environment versus economy, foresight versus jobs now, are the kinds of frames that have been used to understand this. And I think you can fit that into this model, right? In terms of like seeing where the limitations are with our reaction to the crisis. So, I mean, I think the whole point of what we're doing with this exercise here is to understand the ways in which A can adapt to a crisis of this sort with multiple actors. So I think that's probably going to be useful in a number of different situations, not just international political one. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say with the example of the ecological crisis, I think if there's anything that resembles a world social brain currently, it's capital and markets, and those just simply do not transduce the information that is actually applicable in the same way that a dog's visual cortex just doesn't process color. And so I think the model is definitely applicable in that sense of these, like, we can see that like one of the glaring problems is that the thing that's analogous to a nervous system in our world society is absolutely degenerate at processing relevant signals. It's really good at processing signals that are relevant to its own psychotic kind of model of the world, but is awful at processing things that we people care about. And I think that squares with what Beer is going on about here.
Yeah, I mean, it is in a sense like the great truth that is not represented, right? Or it is represented, but it's represented in how can we make green capitalism work? How can we make Elon Musk the richest man in the world? Or
it's just left as like completely noumenal. It's like they just stop thinking about it and put the fucking like butcher's knife down and go, nope, no further, and just leave it off. Or try to, yeah, as you said, like sneak it back in sort of by like, how can we make this be a market?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like right now the markets are all in on green capitalism, right? They're like, oh, the Democrats have a Senate majority. Okay, let's buy green energy stocks, and suddenly Elon Musk is the richest man in the world.
I think we probably talked about it like last year, but it's maybe worth mentioning again. But like my observation that like the Tories have come out with like a kind of Green New Deal alike sort of thing, and who knows, it's probably horseshit. They'll probably never actually do it or whatever. But it's interesting that like in both the US and the UK, and probably in all sorts of other places, they're now able to entertain these kinds of Green New Deal kinds of things after the left was defeated. Like once the Green New Deal stuff was shorn of all of its class content, then they could let it on the table. But which I think is a kind of recurring thing there, that like they'll entertain the concessions and the changes, but they'll never entertain you having power. That like they'll never give up control. They'll give up concessions all the time, but they'll never give up the control. So you can probably trick them into all kinds of shit if you like put something on the table with class power and then take the class power away. You can like, but like, you're right, Kyle. It's like now that the class content is fucking sliced off, they're able to entertain it.
Yeah, and I mean, to be clear, like none of this shit is actually going to address the ecological crisis we're in. Like, it's just like, oh yeah, now like, you know, there's going to be like an invasion of Bolivia to get their fucking lithium and you know, all this other nonsense that's going to happen, so everyone can have an electric car. And like it's just new ways to make markets. That's why you know, that's why like capital F of, or sorry, lowercase f of a, the feed forward loop is still just operating in this extremely limited conceptual framework, right?
That does fit the example here, right? That like it's once you cleave off all of the stuff that doesn't fit the existing model, which is just all markets all the time. Yeah. Once you've lobbed everything off to make it down into the peg that will fit the hole, it'll slide right in there. Whether it actually does anything useful or not is another question entirely.
Yeah, it really doesn't matter to A if A is.
It just wants the peg to fit the hole. That's
yeah. It's just trying to balance the sensory and the motor. That's all it's trying to do. Matt, go ahead.
I mean, I think you know, what like the most likely outcome is, you know, some version of climate imperialism where, you know, you get more like international agreements that, you know, like enshrine, you know, intellectual property like above a nation state's like actual laws, you know, like just to make sure that, you know, like I know I could see there actually being like a you know, a Tory a Green New Deal, but I mean, you know, like baked into that will of course be that, you know, Trident will hit any country that, you know, tries to use some kind of you know, a less polluting you know, extraction process for some kind of mineral. Yeah, like going back to the Four Futures article, you know, like but I mean, like, the thing is, exterminism was like something that they might have done. So I mean, you know, going from exterminism to rentism, you know, that is an improvement, but you know, like minimally it gives us more time. But yeah, I mean, I'm also thinking of like the you know, the bait and switch Shane mentioned earlier. That's kind of useful. I think you can even think of it in terms of like, you know, the different System 5 modes where, like, you know, if they see anything that's sort of on the table of actually like harming their power, they're suddenly a lot more willing to negotiate about things that, like, you know, that they probably didn't want to before. You know, they think, oh, you know, I'm making enough money from, you know, my extraction industry right now. You know, what do I care from any of this? But you know, like, once there's even a possibility of, like, you know, the fundamental arrangement changing, suddenly they're in panic mode. Suddenly they're a lot more, you know, willing to negotiate. I think the real, you know, the real trick is to build an organization that has enough variety to take advantage of that without, you know, just becoming complacent afterwards once you've got the concessions. Because, you know, you could strategically actually like get stuff that, you know, makes it easier for you to do your next stage, but, you know, you have to not just like lay down as soon as you get it.
Right. Sure. Yeah. That's certainly true. Yeah, so again, like people are kind of mentioning, like, basically like climate Leviathan, right? That's kind of the centrist response to the climate crisis would be something like the compromise between the Labour Green New Deal and the Tory Green New Deal would be this very EU style global administration to maintain green capitalism everywhere. All right. Well, I think we've come up on time and we finished up that section. So next time we're going to go to section 3. Yes, the ecological union. There you go. We did it, folks. Great. Now we can have incredibly shitty neoliberal dictatorial bureaucracy that runs our new eco-capitalism. Okay, yeah, we finished section 2. We're going to move on to section 3 next time. So that'll be next week. I will see you all then. Thanks for participating. It's been a good discussion.
Wonderful.
And
thanks, everyone.
Yeah, happy New Year.
Everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.